This is the Jocko Unraveling podcast, number 35, with Darryl Cooper and myself. And we are going to hit a subject that is, well, I guess it's a subject that we kind of have to talk about. What is the subject? Is the subject mass killings? Is that the subject?
That question is maybe the topic of the episode. Yeah, I mean, is it the subject mental health? Is it firearms policy? Is it the way we're raising our kids? Media? Is it gun? I think that's the question we really need to discuss here.
Here's something to think about as we go through this. Let me give you a quote. If I cannot join them, I will rise above them. And if I cannot rise above them, I will destroy them. I've been trying to join and be accepted among the beautiful people, popular people all my life, but it was to no avail. They have always treated me like scum. Girls have always deemed me unworthy of their love and sex. I tried to overthrow them by gaining wealth at a young age, from trying to come up with invention ideas to contemplating writing an epic story and finally trying to win the lottery. At this point, the prospect of overthrowing them seemed helpless. The final solution to triumph over my enemies was to destroy them, to carry out my day of retribution, to exact my ultimate and devastating vengeance against all of the popular young people who never accepted me, and all against all the women for rejecting me and starving me of their love and sex, end quote. And that's Elliot Rodger, who in 2014 committed a mass murder up in Isla Vista, California, right out of the University of Santa Barbara. I mean, it's a crazy place, beautiful place. Killed 6. He died. He committed suicide as well, injured 13. He wrote this 100,000 word manifesto, which a book is, like 70, 80,000 words. This kid wrote a book, and there's weird. I mean, it's hard to figure out where to open up this can, because this was a kid who was driving around in a new BMW that his mom bought him so he'd feel better. This is a kid who had money, who had, he had connections. His parents were well connected in Hollywood. His dad was is in the movie industry and would go to movie premieres, and he would go to movie premieres and things like this. And this is a one-off case. And right now we're reeling from the latest mass shooting down in Texas. 18-year-old male shot and killed 21 people, 19 of which were children, 9, 10, 11 years old. And, and 2 of them were teachers. But, 9, 10, 11-year-old kids aren't adults. They're not adults. They don't have... It's hard, even if you're angry at the world and you're angry at humanity, it's kind of hard to put a 9-year-old in the category of humanity, because they're not really a part of humanity yet. They're too young. They're not doing any evil things at 9 years old, at 10 years old. I mean, it was even worse at Sandy Hook, where the kids were even younger than that. And yet, you sent over a quote where as you try and categorize, or you try and figure out, or you try to put some, you try and categorize these things. You look at the Columbine shooters. This is from a book by Sue Klebold, who is the mother of Dylan Klebold, who was one of the Columbine shooters. She says, Dylan and Eric had already been in certain quarters heralded as champions for a cause. Tom and I received chilling letters from alienated kids expressing admiration for Dylan and what he'd done. Adults who had been bullied as children wrote to tell us they could relate to the boys and their actions. Girls flooded us with love letters. Young men left messages on our answering machine calling Dylan a god, a hero. An acquaintance working at a youth correctional facility told me some of the imprisoned boys cheered as they watched the television coverage of the destruction of the school. Columbine-related materials were found among Virginia Tech shooter Cho's possession and in the Sandy Hook Elementary school shooter Adam Lanza's belongings. So these guys, by some parts of society, are being held up as heroes and being imitated, and I'm sure we'll get to that.
You see two other examples of that. If you go on to some of the hardcore, like right-wing, white supremacist angle, like websites, or even things like 4chan, 8chan, things like that, you'll still see people on like 4chan, and it's a minority, and they'll usually get shouted down by the rest of the people, but in every thread where it comes up, you'll find somebody or a couple people who heap praise on Anders Breivik, that killer from Norway from a few years ago, Brendan Tarrant, the one from New Zealand. Those people will pipe in. And, I'm assuming that when Anders Breivik and Brendan Tarrant went onto those websites themselves, they probably saw some people, again, not all, but some people praising, I don't know, the Columbine shooters or some other person that they ended up imitating.
Now, what's interesting about the Columbine shooters, and you and I were talking about this before we pressed record. You sit back, and I've got 4 kids. You don't have any kids yet, but I have 4 kids, and you think, how does a parent miss kids that are plotting for over a year to do this heinous act? But they really did a good job of sort of masking their intentions.
Yeah, the Columbine one it's really hard to classify along with the rest of these. Like, you can look at something like Kip Kinkle, which happened a few months before Columbine in Oregon. You can look at Adam Lanza, the Sandy Hook killer, the Buffalo shooter recently, the kid down in Parkland, Florida, a while back. And you look at those, and you have this isolated loner who his personality is in the process of disassembling, essentially. And, maybe he's got a single mother, somebody around who should be watching them, but they're not. And they're just sort of like left to themselves to just degenerate into something that could go do something like that. The Columbine kids, pretty much every psychologist that's ever looked at those 2 kids, and we've got a lot of material from them. They left us their journals. They left us a whole bunch of tapes they made together. They were in a very well put together community, and so they were known to a lot of people. They had friends, they had families, etc.
They had gone to the prom.
Yeah.
Right?
And every psychologist that's really looked at that has come to the conclusion that these 2 kids were not out of their minds or insane or whatever in any way. Obviously you could just say, well, if you're going to go shoot up your school, you're crazy. But in any way that we would normally classify that in a medical sense, that these kids were not mentally ill in that sense. And as far as like how you could miss something like that, again, Columbine is really it's an outlier in many ways because these were 2 kids who, Columbine was a very high agency attack. They planned it for a year, like you said. They had to do things like, as minors, go out and procure illegal firearms. They had to hide them from their parents, and they went to great lengths to do that. In fact, one of Eric Harris's firearms wasn't even found by the police in his room when they went through and searched the whole place, and they were taking everything, tearing the whole place apart. It was found like months later. And they write about this and talk about this in the videos, how they were putting a lot of work into making sure their parents had no inkling of what was going on, making sure their friends didn't know what was going on. The day of the attack, they had learned to make propane bombs and pipe bombs. Their propane bombs, thank God, didn't go off, but they went through the trouble of doing it. They planted a bomb across town to divert the police while they were doing their attack. Talking about a very high agency, almost like non-ideological terrorist attack, essentially, where the 2 shooters they're not Elliot Rodgers. These kids were, they weren't the varsity quarterback, but they had a big group of friends. Eric Harris had girlfriends. Both of them went to prom, like you said, with dates the weekend before, or 2 weekends before, I think it was. And so, you look at somebody like Adam Lanza. There's a great New Yorker article that came out maybe like 2015 or so about Lanza, and it is incredibly haunting because it goes through and just describes, he was with his mother. He hadn't seen his father in like 2 years at the time of the shooting. His father wasn't some evil guy or anything. He was just, he lived a few hours away. It was a broken up marriage, and the mother didn't really want him around. And Adam Lanza killed his mother, obviously, but the father's still alive. And so a lot of the article is based on discussions with the father. And, he talks about how, his ex-wife, the kid's mother, he was an adult by this point, but Lanza's mother, who he didn't have a good relationship with, the husband, but he says, like, she knew there was a problem and she was trying, and they go through all the different ways that she was trying to get him help and, wasn't able to do that. There are a lot of other situations where you look at them and you just, so many of these situations where these people are all but putting up a billboard in Times Square saying, I'm going to go kill a bunch of people, and nobody is paying attention. And it's hard to really understand how that's even possible because, in this day and age, I guess it's just the parents' responsibility. Maybe the FBI should somehow figure out, how to track these people and identify them or whatever. But, I think when you ask the question of like,
hold on, what do you mean by that? Maybe the FBI should figure out all these people.
These are like solutions that people are kind of putting out there of who should be responsible for like finding out who these people are and tracking them. Whereas if because like the real question, right, this is a question if you want to talk about the gun policy angle or just the social and cultural angle in general. A question I think really has to be answered is that why did this stuff not really happen before like the 1980s? There's a couple like things here and there, but it really didn't happen much. There were plenty of guns. There was plenty of violence. And, one of the things among many that comes to mind is that you go back 100 years, and if you had a young male in a community who was starting to go a little bit off the rails, in most cases it was not just his mom who should have been watching him. There was an embeddedness in like a whole social network, a community. Even if he was kind of an outcast from the community, people were at least paying attention and knew who he was. He was known to people. And that these people would maybe be corralled in a way, or at least noticed in a way that they're really not anymore.
So just to put a little bit of a little bit of data behind what we're talking about here, this is a relatively new phenomenon, and when I was reading through a bunch of these, and the first one I could find, the first kind of lashing out at humanity was the one that I found was in 1949. They called it the Walk of Death. A war veteran, 1949, so the war's been over for 4 years. He went out and sort of unprovoked shot 16 people. And so that happened in 1949. Then there's like huge gaps where these things don't happen. And we don't get into this sort of just repetitive killing until the last 20, 25, maybe 30 years?
Say since Columbine.
Yeah, Columbine seemed to be a turning point of sorts. Now, look, there were some other pretty big ones. I mean, clearly we had the University of Texas, right? You had Charles Whitman, he, former Marine, killed his wife and his mother, and then killed. This is 1966. Just before that, 1965, there was a guy, a 16-year-old kid, stole his dad's gun and killed 3, and then killed himself on the 101 highway.
Whitman left a note telling people, when you find my body, do an autopsy and look at my brain. There's something wrong with my brain, and they did. And he had a giant tumor in his brain.
You get Whitman, that's 66. In the 60s and 70s, it's just out of control. But these are all sort of, for the most part, political kind of these revolutionary killings. And by the way, you had that in the early 1900s too, right? You had, usually these were either race racial events or workers, worker events, right? Unions,
Anarchists, things like that.
Anarchists, unions, either unions killing scabs or police killing unions. You had those things going on, but again, these you could at least you have some kind of reason behind it.
Sure.
Before you get into these, just I'm going to kill people. That's the goal, is to kill people.
Like you can kind of explain those the same way you explain war. And in our society way of looking at things, war is sort of is a more legitimate means of that kind of thing. But to those people, they see it that way at least.
1976, Cal State Fullerton. A psychologically disturbed man killed 7. 1979, San Diego Cleveland Elementary School.
That's right. Yeah.
Yep. Brenda Spencer. This is the girl that when they asked her why she did it, she said, "I don't like Mondays."
That's right.
82, there was a welding shop shooting. 84, there was Tyrone Mitchell.
Was that the San Ysidro one? No, that was
killed 2, wounded 12, killed himself. He was one of your people from the People's Temple.
Oh, okay.
He was from Jim Jones.
Sure, right. Yeah, there were actually several People's Temple's members who came out after that and did some version of that, murder, suicide. One of them, and that might have been him, was up on an overpass shooting at people.
Yeah, and just so I don't get you in trouble, the reason I said that these are Darryl's people is because Darryl did a fantastic series podcast on his Martyr Made podcast about the People's Temple. So now we get to July 1984. This is San Ysidro. This is the San Ysidro McDonald's massacre. Man, San Diego popular for these mass shootings.
In the West Coast in general, for not only mass killers but also serial killers, which is something I haven't been able to put 2 and 2 together for, but it's kind of interesting.
22 killed at the San Ysidro McDonald's, 19 wounded. And this is a guy who had asked for help like the day before. Didn't get a call back.
Sat for hours waiting for a call back after trying to get, an appointment at a mental hospital or somebody to see him. They spelled his name wrong, it turns out.
He was a paranoid guy. He was a conspiracy guy. He was abused his wife and daughters, and he called for help and didn't get it. 86. This is where you get the first post office shooting. 15 killed, 6 wounded, and then suicide. It was a guy named Patrick Henry Sherrill, Marine Corps. This is the first of the postal incidents. So, you hear the term going postal. Well, here's why. 1991, Ridgewood, New Jersey. 1991, Royal Oak, Michigan. 1993, Dearborn, Michigan. 1993, Dana Point, California. 1995, Montclair, New Jersey. 1997, Milwaukee, Wisconsin. 2006, Goleta, California. This is where you get the postal, urban dictionary definition of going postal.
And, sometimes I wonder, and maybe this is a topic of conversation, that having to do sort of with the copycat idea that, just having the term going postal, being in the air, that everybody kind of knows, you almost wonder if, there are disgruntled employees at workplaces all over the country. But when that term's floating in the air, some percentage of mentally disturbed postal workers at a time I could go it's like it's in the air. It's like an option.
This is social contagion. That's what it is. And that's what that is, right? There's something out there. It's in the air. This is what's happening. This is what we're doing. This is what's going on. And this is a thing that happens. It's a social contagion. And social contagion, the where this comes from, one of the examples that they use is bulimia. So it first got published in the Journal of Mental Disorders. It was in 1979. The guy says, there's a disease. It's called bulimia, where people, usually female, throw up their food after they eat it, and they get really sick and starve. After that got published, all of a sudden there was a lot more cases. Now, is part of that because now a dad can say, oh, my daughter's doing this. I need to report her because I didn't know what this was. I thought she was just, feeling sick and a bunch and maybe she had something wrong with her stomach. But sure, some of it goes up, but some of it was people see it. People see it's happening. They say the same thing about suicide prevention hotline posters. Put those up in a community. Suicide doesn't go down, suicide goes up. There's a bunch of examples like that. Cutting, again, this is a phenomenon with young females usually where they cut themselves, and it will spread through a community. Suicide. Adolescents who know about a friend's suicide are nearly twice as likely to attempt suicide within a year. This is a social contagion. It spreads. There's clusters. That's why there's clusters of suicides. One kid kills themselves, 3, 4 more. They all do the same thing. It spreads. Mass shootings happens as well. I had a little quote from NPR. School shootings and other shootings with 4 or more deaths spread like a contagion. Each shooting tends to spark more shootings.
There's something, back in the 1800s, something called the Werther effect, based on Goethe's book, The Sorrows of Young Werther. He kills himself in a blue shirt and or blue jacket and yellow pants, or maybe it's reversed in the book. And in the 1800s, there was a whole spate of young dudes committing suicide wearing that same outfit.
So this stuff spreads. This stuff spreads. There's no doubt about this. This stuff spreads. It's like a trend. It's like the freaking hula hoop, or the yo-yo.
You've seen that thing recently where young girls on TikTok are like getting basically what looks like Tourette's.
No.
Yeah, it's like it was in the New York Times and stuff. They were writing about it. Apparently, it's this widespread epidemic of young girls who are getting all of these tics and weird like Tourette's symptoms, and it's spreading through TikTok apparently. Which is this is such a whole new phenomenon that like if you were to try to describe any of this to people just a few years ago, like they wouldn't have. I don't know what to make of it now.
So this is one of the first thing that gets thrown out, when you talk about these, what can we do about these things? And one of the first thing that gets thrown out is, well, if we get rid of guns or we restrict guns more, there'll be less of these. And then the immediate response to that is often, hey, when I was growing up, kids brought guns to school. They had a gun rack in their car. That was absolutely true with me. I remember my dad telling me that there was a guy in his school. My dad was a teacher. My mom was a teacher. They had a shooting club, and the teacher would sell guns and do gun transactions in the classroom. Like, oh yeah, bring the gun in. You want to sell it to Billy? Cool. Yeah, Darryl wants a new gun. Oh, Billy's selling his. Bring it into school. There you go. And by the way, we're going shooting after school. So there's, the guns have been around for a long time. Look, are there things that could be done there? Sure. I'm sure there are. But to me, and I was talking about this with my daughter, she's like, well, what is your point? My daughter was asked. My daughter's 22 years old. She's, I was kind of talking to her about what we were talking about today. And I had to think about that. She's like, well, you're just going to get there and say everyone's killing each other and that's the end, that's what you're going to offer people. Well, I don't know if I should, or I don't know if I can say this, or I don't know if I should say this, or I don't know if it even makes sense to say this. But it certainly seems to me that this is a multifaceted issue where there's many, many problems that are all that by themselves aren't that big of a problem. And they're very seldom a problem. But then when you take all these facets and you join them together, occasionally, on a very rare occasion, you get a freaking major catastrophic issue. So, what's a major catastrophic issue is when a 18-year-old goes out and goes into a school and kills 19 kids and 2 adults. That's like obviously a major catastrophic issue. And then this is happening on a regular basis. So a fairly regular basis, I should say. Now, you could look at all these contributing factors to any of these cases. The availability of the guns, the availability of the access to the places where they're going, the lack of law enforcement training, the use of psychological drugs, the use of social media, the playing of first-person shooter video games, we could go on with this list, the glamorizing of violence in Hollywood, and here, so you could take all those things. Look, violent video games. Does 99.9% of the population enjoy and play those and has no negative effects? Absolutely. Psychological drugs that are prescribed by doctors. Does 99.9% of the population use those to good effect and it helps them cope with whatever they're dealing with? Yes, absolutely. Violent movies. Don't 99.9% of people go to a violent movie and say, wow, I got to experience this horrible war. I'm glad I don't have to really live through that. Yes. Don't 99.9% of people use firearms for protection or for either household protection, or they like to shoot because they like the skill of shooting, or they go hunting? Yes. So you got all these things that by themselves, 99.9% of the time, it's not that it's fine. It's perfectly fine. So to sit and condemn video games, or to condemn violent movies, or to condemn weapons, or to condemn drugs, what do we call psychiatric drugs? I guess psychiatric drugs, psychotropic drugs. To condemn these things and say, well, we just have something. You can't really do it because there's too many people that benefit from these things. And look, there's people that benefit from having a nice escape from their reality. They're sitting in a cubicle all day. They get home at night. They want to play freaking Call of Duty, and it's fun. And they get to experience something, and it gets their adrenaline going, and they make friends. Okay. Someone goes and see a violent movie. Okay. Someone listens to music with violent lyrics. Okay. Someone goes to a counselor and gets prescribed drugs. Like, okay, there's all these things that when you take them individually, if you were to do an operational risk assessment, which we did in the military, alone, each one of these things has such a low probability of causing a problem that you would okay the mission. You'd say, yeah, okay, there's a 99.9% chance that this is fine. Cool. And here's the benefits. Okay. But when you put all these things together, then you have occasionally that 0.01% chance that it messes this guy up in such a way. And then there's also a 0.01 chance that he also happens to be on this drug, and a 0.01 chance that he also happens to see a violent movie where this stuff is depicted. And then you end up with a catastrophic scenario. So what I was getting at earlier is, it seems like we need to make a cultural adjustment in a whole bunch of areas. And that's such a huge thing to say that it's kind of like saying, well, we're in war. What should we do? We should win the war. So it's almost a worthless statement that I'm making. That being said, are there things that we can do? I think there are.
I think that it's worth talking about the mental health aspect a little bit more deeply. I was doing some research on the trend of deinstitutionalization that took place. Really, it started in the 50s and really accelerated in the 70s and 80s and kind of consummated in the 80s.
And just to, I'm sure you're going to say this, but deinstitutionalization, that means before, in the past, if you were mentally unstable, if you had issues, they were going to take you and they were going to put you somewhere, Sunnydale, mental hospital, or whatever, the Arkham Asylum, whatever the stereotypical name is of a place where they take people that are having mental issues and they take them and put them there.
Yeah, and the mentality was, that if you are presenting in a way that people around you feel is threatening, we're going to put you away, whether you like it or not, and you will get out when we feel confident that it's safe to let you out. Now, of course, as you got into the 60s and 70s, it was really this confluence of two forces, right? Where you had the liberal activists who were looking at a situation like that, and for sure there were people who were being committed who probably shouldn't have been. There were husbands who didn't want their wives around who were having them committed. There were several like very high-profile scandals where the patients were just being radically neglected and mistreated, and very publicized. And so there was a big backlash against it at the same time where you had where from the conservative side, who might be more interested in sort of social control and that kind of thing, wanted to cut budgets. And so these two things kind of came together, and you went from a situation in 1955 where you had 340 mental health patient beds per 100,000 Americans to 2008, I think it is, 2007, where there are 17 beds per 100,000. That's a 95% decrease in the inpatient resources that are available over this period of time. And so we ask, what does that mean? And you say,
but by the way, we're doing that. So we're getting rid of, 95% of the opportunities for people that have mental health issues to go and get help and be somewhere where they're not going to hurt themselves or not going to hurt anybody else. And then on top of that, you throw into the societal mix, the mayhem, the violence, the first-person shooter games, the drugs that people are on, whether they're prescribed or they're illegal. And then you put them in a social media world where they're by themselves, where they're outcast, where they're alone.
And a social media world that lacks any of like the accountability or the guardrails of like normal in-person physical interaction, and so what you're left with when you see that is like that there are many times, with 95% decrease, if you just take that number, that you say there are 20 times the number of people walking around among us today who in 1955 would not have been allowed to do that. Now, some of those people shouldn't have been in those places, but maybe it's like the bottom line is there's a massive number of people walking among us today who in the past would not have been allowed to do that. And, it's always tough, right? Because, for example, even when people talk about mental health checks for firearms, like I understand for sure why everybody is uncomfortable with that, because there are a lot of people out there who think that I don't know if you think that climate change is such a big issue that like these oil companies have to be stopped no matter what, or if you think the 2020 election was stolen or whatever it is, that maybe your conspiracy theory addled brain over there like is not fit to have a firearm, and there are people worried about that. I understand those fears, like for good reason. But the bottom line, I think, or maybe it's not the bottom line, but it's worth noting that there are people out there who are legally allowed to buy a gun today who a few decades ago would not have legally been allowed on the street, period. And, there are going to be consequences for something like that. I mean, you talk about, what's his name, James Huberty, the guy from San Ysidro McDonald's shooting back in '84. Tells his wife the day before, I've got mental health issues, I'm going to do something terrible. Spends hours on the phone trying to get an appointment with a mental hospital or get in to see somebody to get some kind of help. Waits around, doesn't get any call back. 48 hours later, says he's going to go hunt some humans and heads into a McDonald's and kills like 25 people or something like that, And that's the kind of thing that would not have happened back when there were 340 inpatient beds per 100,000 people.
Right, because there's a bunch of logistics behind that, administrative support, and yeah, it's a very, very bizarre situation where you hear about mental health all the time. This is sort of a trending topic on a daily basis. And maybe I see a lot of it from the veteran community, and the veterans talk about mental health, but I also see it from the first responder community, but then you also see it at large. People talk about mental health. And here we are, where in 1955, there was 340 mental health inpatient beds for every 100,000, and now there's only 17. So as much as we're talking about mental health, we've gone in the opposite direction of being able to support these people. Now, listen, you go and watch One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, and you think, hey, this is horrible, and we shouldn't put anybody in an institution, in a mental institution. So I'm sure that movie, when did that movie come out? 70s maybe?
Early 70s.
Yeah. So that's the kind of thing where you have an extreme backlash against like you said, people get abused, and it's sort of like even one of the principles in America is we'd rather have 100 guilty people go free than one innocent person be convicted and sent to prison or put to death.
The
right?
question here is: would you like to have 100 guilty people go free, as opposed, or rather, would you, in order to get that one innocent person from getting stuck in a place like that, are you willing to allow 100 people to go shoot up a school?
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
So you can use sort of the same argument, or I'm sure that argument was used when you look at, this person was this woman was put in a psychiatric ward by her husband, who was an evil guy who gaslit her and called and planted stuff on her, and now she's stuck in this place. And go, that should never happen. And now we've gone so far in the other direction where we only have 17 beds for every 100,000. And listen, you don't have to be a freaking rocket scientist to realize that out of a population of 100,000, you've got more than 17 people that need some mental health help. There's no doubt about that. And it's also interesting, what's going on with the homeless population. What percentage of homeless population has mental health disorders? And I was talking to a police officer the other day, and he was just explaining to me, he said, we want to help these people. We want to help these people. They don't belong in prison. But guess what? You put them on the street. What are they going to do? They got to eat. They're crazy, so they're yelling at people. Someone says something back to them, and they attack them. They don't belong in prison. They're mentally not well. And so the fact that we've shut down these types of institutions to send people that need help is wrong. So this is a huge part of this. And in talking to that police officer, it's one of those problems that the police have. And that's why, we live in San Diego. San Diego has a pretty bad homeless problem, depending on where you go. And if you go and you observe those homeless people, or you talk to those homeless people, they're not mentally there, a lot of them. A lot of them are not mentally there. You can tell. You can look at them for 5 seconds. You can say hi to them, and you can tell that they have some kind of mental issue going on. I would say 90% of them. Well, no, I would say maybe 70% of them. Probably a bunch of them have, alcohol and drug problems.
Yeah, a lot of the ones that you don't really see. They stay out of the way. You don't see them wandering the streets and stuff. So,
right.
Yeah.
So this is a huge thing that we need to look at. And again, I guess what we should just break this down is sort of like, what things can we look at to try and improve and decrease these situations?
Well, I think we have to. One thing we have to admit, though, is that it's not some crazy homeless person who's getting his hands on a gun and going and shooting a bunch of places up. And the thing this is another thing that can come up in the discussion about firearms policy, but it's, I think, a critical question, because I wrote it in the notes here, which is that you look at the inner cities, the black inner cities where there's plenty of guns, there's lots of gun violence, Southside Chicago, whatever. What you don't have is some 14-year-old who decides to just wander into his school and just kill as many random people as possible. It just didn't really happen. Maybe it's happened once or something. I couldn't find it, actually, if it had. You have mass shootings that will count in FBI statistics, but those are I hate that guy, I'm going to shoot over there, and I hit 5 people or something.
Gang related.
Yeah, or and I don't think anybody means that when they talk about these things. And so you have to ask that question, why, I think, for example, if you have, you talk about cutting, suicide, all of these things, all of these issues, bulimia, all these things have all radically increased over the last 20, 25 years since the late 90s, right? You have a massive increase in suicide rates, especially among young people, and other types of self-harm, cutting, things like that, patient admissions for that. You have a huge explosion of these, riots that when we get into it and we look at some people there are activists, some people are hardcore political radicals, but there's a ton of mentally unstable, like in the Kenosha thing with Kyle Rittenhouse, one of the guys he shot had gotten out. He was this just a completely insane pedophile who was. We have a huge explosion of that kind of behavior. You have, we start seeing maybe back in the late 2010s, start getting all these videos of these, these kids on college campuses who apparently are completely emotionally unable to handle like just very basic obstacles in their life, having emotional breakdowns and over, very small things. You have like widespread youth identity crises, whether it's an explosion of the trans phenomenon, but then also like, that's kind of been expanded out now. You have all these spin-offs, right? Like people who think they're unicorns, people who think that they're mythical creatures, or, the furries, or just all of these other strange things that, are sort of spreading like a social contagion. And you look at all of that, or I look at all of it and I ask, well, like maybe all of that is connected somehow. And maybe, when a girl is having certain kinds of problems, she goes and hurts herself. And maybe when a boy does that, he goes and hurts other people, sometimes. And that maybe this is all kind of part of the same phenomenon that's going on. I mean, when you look at the mental health numbers, like I wrote some of them down here, among young people, the rate of, this one's for adults, but the rate of suicidal ideation among adults has increased every year since 2011 to 2012. So first of all, just right there, that's 10 years straight of increase. Anxiety disorders among 18 to 25-year-olds doubled between 2008 and 2018. And when you think about that, 2008, 2018, you're not talking about the same group of people who are more anxious. You're talking about different groups of people, right? So in 2008, an 18-year-old was born in 1990. In 2018, that 18-year-old was born in, 2000, probably had an iPhone at 10 years old. A lot of these other type of social changes we're talking about. Among high school students between 2009 and 2019, this is according to the CDC, a 40% increase in persistent feelings of sadness or hopelessness, 36% increase in answering that I've seriously considered attempting suicide. And in another episode back that we did, I mentioned CDC's mental health survey last year in 2021, where they came out and said for people between 16 and 24 years old, male and female combined, the number of people who answered yes to the question, have you seriously considered, and seriously was in the answer, have you seriously considered committing suicide in the last 30 days? Male and female between 16 to 24, 26% said yes. 26%. Now, you hear that, like my response to that, when I saw that, when I was hearing about it, it was like, how are we not like stopping everything, calling an emergency congressional session to like figure out why a quarter of our young people said that they thought about killing themselves in the last, seriously thought about killing themselves in the last 30 days. But not only is that not happening, like it didn't even make the papers. Forget about the front page, like you couldn't find it on page 6. And so this is just kind of happening in the background, and we're not addressing it really at all. And, in 2021, just last year, and obviously you have to take COVID into account for this one, 44% of high school students reported feeling persistently sad or hopeless for a period of at least 1 month at some point in the past year. And so you think like, all right, so we radically decreased our public resources that are devoted to mental health care. We put tens of millions of kids on psychotropic drugs for which we have no long-term data on how this affects you if you take it for 20, 30, 40 years or whatever. Just radically ramped up the level of like ultra violence and extreme sexuality in media that kids are exposed to, video games, et cetera. And again, it's one of those things where it's not a single cause, and I understand why because most people are fine and they get offended when you sort of like the same reason there's a lot of veterans groups and stuff who get a little uncomfortable with the way some people handle the PTSD conversation because they don't want it to stigmatize the large majority of people who don't have those issues or even the ones who do. It's the same thing with like media and video games. A lot of people that watch them who are just fine, but the bottom line is, kids grow up watching today. Like a lot of kids, a whole lot of kids. It is common to grow up watching or playing things that would have gotten you thrown in prison 50 or 60 years ago for trying to release. No shit. Like that is the reality. And then we, profoundly disordered our sexual norms, our sort of courtship, norms between like young people or even adult people, and radically disrupted the family structure. And we did all of those things I just listed over the course of about 20 years. And then during that same period of time, we see a huge ramp up in serial killers in the 70s and 80s. Then a whole bunch of mass shootings starting in the 80s and really ramping up in the late 90s up until now. And our answer to that is, well, it must be the guns that were always there to begin with and that exist in the ghetto where they don't have any of these issues. And there's just a whole bunch of other reasons. And I'm not saying, look, if you could snap your fingers and every firearm on the planet would just disappear, we'd probably have a lot fewer of these things. You'd have fewer wars, too. Obviously, that's not an option, I'm not saying that's not something that would be a prophylactic if you could actually pull it off. But I feel like the firearms discussion, in a lot of ways, it's a way for us, and I'm not saying people are doing this tactically. I think it's almost like a psychological defense, almost in a way, where it's something that we can latch on to as a tangible solution that seems, like it could just physically stop the thing from happening, so that we don't have to look at any of these other things in any serious way, because doing so would mean, considering the possibility that just a huge number of all of these social trends and cultural trends that we've all been embracing for the last 50 or 60 years were all a huge mistake, and that we've done profound damage to our children, to our culture, and that undoing some of that damage would mean, undoing whole industries. That's one aspect. It's an economic and financial aspect of it, but also just admitting that, because it's not as if we just did these things for money. We did it because we thought it was the right thing to do. It seemed like we were liberating people. We were, all of these things that came out of the 60s and 70s, and having to reevaluate all that.
As you were talking about that, and we were talking earlier, you and I, before we pressed record, were talking about the fact that if you were to look at what you and I were like and the people that we knew, you and I could name 10, 15 people each that when we were growing up, or people that we, knew or associated with, or at least knew in our school, or, from wherever, from, the scene. You go, man, this dude's a little bit crazy. I look at some of the stuff that I wrote when I was freaking 15, 16 years old. It's not healthy. It certainly doesn't seem healthy. Talking about getting after it, talking about killing, talking about death, talking about all those things. I would write about those things when I was a kid, 15, 16 years old, 14 years old. Even younger than that, I got freaking taken to the counselor at my school because I wrote a poem about death when I was I want to say I was in 6th grade. 6th grade, I wrote a poem about death. It was pretty cool. I in the poem, I drew like a grim reaper and his sickle, and underneath his sickle was this poem about death. And they were like, oh my gosh.
I used to see stuff like that too.
Yeah. So there you go. So stuff like that happens, right? And when you're growing up, you're dealing with these things. And my point in saying that is okay, so kids think about some crazy shit when they're younger. And then what happens to them? What do you say to them? And you get this thing now where some of it's kind of encouraged, whether it's encouraged by your peers, the social media, the people that are looking around you going, oh yeah, that's great. It's almost like positive that you feel bad that you're telling everyone. And this is where you get this horrible dichotomy, because some people that have, if you have some mental issues, you got some stuff you got to work through, it's really good in most cases. You go and talk to somebody about it and get those things off your chest and tell people how you feel. And the people say, oh, okay, I understand. Here's what you can do to help. And no one really says yeah, hey dude, everyone kind of feels that way. You're young. You'll get over it. Push through it. Which is something that also can help you when you're young and you got dumped by the girl, or you got rejected by the girl, or your friends, aren't hanging out with you, or you're frustrated because you're not as smart as you wanted to be, or you didn't make the football team, all these things that piss you off when you're young. And someone goes, hey dude, yeah, suck it up. Try harder. Work harder.
Doesn't it? One
more thing, because you led me right into this. discipline equals freedom, right? Discipline equals freedom is it's a saying that I've said. It's a book that I've written, and it's true. If you want to have freedom in life, you need to start with discipline. And so what you were, the entire tirade that you just went on about all these things that we've done, which we did in a positive way, or at least with a positive mindset of, hey, we're going to liberate, we're going to open up people's minds, we're going to let people be free and do whatever you want to do, kind of, and say whatever you want to say, kind of. And yet, with that just unmitigated freedom, all of a sudden there's no boundaries, and all of a sudden there's no difference between right and wrong, and all of a sudden you can literally do whatever you want, and that is when you run into a problem. So when you've taken away a lot of these societal norms and the discipline that comes from society, that you get told, hey man, you can't do that. Hey, quit acting like that. Hey, no, we don't do that. Stop doing that. Who's saying that right now? Who's discipline, who's putting structure around a 16-year-old kid that is going in a bad direction, and his parents don't say, hey, you can't do that. You can't act like that. Hey, if you do that again, you're going to get in trouble. Here's the punishment. Here's what's going to happen. And if you know anything about me, I am not a tyrannical parent at all. In fact, I always constantly tell people, like, when my kids were younger, they didn't even have a curfew. None of them. Come home when you're done. I was not a tyrannical parent at all. I gave them a lot of freedom. But my kids also knew, like, hey, here's the box. If you step out of this box, it's going to be an issue. It's going to be a big issue. So you can have a lot of freedom, but here are the norms that you have to sort of remain within. And if you want to push outside those norms, okay, come and talk to me about it. Maybe you've got a point that I don't understand. That's okay. But there's probably also some things that you don't understand. Maybe you don't understand how this is going to impact the rest of your life. Maybe you don't understand how this might impact your relationship with other people. Maybe you don't understand how this could impact your future. And so you put your kids into a box and make that box as big as you can. But I think right now there's a lot of kids where the box is just wide open. Do whatever you want. And not only is your behavior that's outside the box, not only is it accepted, it's encouraged. It's completely encouraged. And so that's what we have to be careful of. I would say I'm so lucky that I joined the military, because I had a bunch of excess energy that I could have put in a million different bad places. And thankfully, I joined the military and was like, oh, here's the box. Here's where you can put this energy. You can expend as much of that energy as you want, as long as it's in this direction over here, and you'll be rewarded for it. And you'll be doing something positive. And I wasn't smart enough to even understand that. But I understood, okay, there's the box. I can stay inside this box. Here's where I can focus my energy.
I was listening a while back to a podcast conversation between Eric Weinstein and the author Bret Easton Ellis, and they were talking about growing up in Los Angeles in like the 70s and 80s, and how sometime like around maybe the mid to late 70s or so, I can't remember which of them that put it this way. I think it was maybe Eric, who said he just sort of like woke up one day and sort of like noticed for the first time that, like, wow, like all of a sudden, like all of my friends' parents are divorced. Like, you know, maybe that wasn't true in like Montana as much, but in a place like, you know, Los Angeles and the communities they were in, Hollywood or whatever, it was much more true. And so very, very clustered in certain ways in urban areas. But this is something that, like, when you look at it, you know, radically ramped up in the 70s and 80s. I mean, tripled the divorce rates in the country. And it's very, very well known. If just about anything is well established in social science when it comes to this stuff right now, it's that fatherlessness or weak father figures, but fatherlessness in general, because the other is harder to quantify, definitely connected with higher rates of violence, including these mass shootings. And, you know, I think it's like part of a larger trend that, I remember when we did our episode on the media, I mentioned how you go back to like 1940 and there's very few televisions in the United States. Most places don't have them. You get up to 1950, or rather 1960, you got 50 million households with televisions. And when you look at like 1965, 1970, the average kid is watching television something like 4 to 6 hours a day. And like on average, like those are the national averages. And I think that with that family breakdown, with the sort of changes in adult behavioral norms that happened in the late 60s and in the 70s and kind of continued on, with the entry of mothers into the workforce, just all of these different changes in family structure and social norms, that a huge amount of parenting kind of got outsourced to the media, right? Which meant basically like, you're letting, I mean, you see us today, like you see like some 2-year-old who's just sat there on YouTube, his mom doesn't want to have him go crazy or whatever at the restaurant, so she just gives him the phone, lets him watch YouTube for as long as it takes. And it's like, I totally understand that. That obviously, like that's, being a parent of a young child is incredibly energy sapping and difficult. And, if you can get them to just let you have a few minutes, I totally understand that. But what has happened over like several decades, and it started back in the 60s, is the outsourcing of a lot of parenting to the media. Now, when I was a kid, I watched a lot of TV, but I think back to like what that TV was, because I grew up without a father. My whole life. My parents divorced when I was 2, and he never got replaced. So I had a single mom growing up the entire time. Now, I was fortunate enough that, I had an uncle and a grandfather who were like strong figures that I could sort of model. And I had a few coaches, things like that came along at critical times, and that was good. But also like, some portion of my capacity to model, like what does a man behave like? What does a family look like, a normal family? Because I didn't really have a normal kind of, family, like your sort of bourgeois American family. I wasn't my family. And so what does that look like? How would I be an adult? Like how can I, when I get to that point? Well, I think back to the TV that I was watching, and we were watching, like I remember every Friday night they had this, like it was a series of shows they called TGIF, and it was like Full House, Family Matters, Step by Step, and all of them were kind of strange families for the sake of comedy. It was these were sitcoms, but they were all basically functional, caring, middle-class families that you could look at and sort of as a model for how a household would function, right? Kids today don't watch that stuff. If they watch TV at all, they're playing video games more. If they, they're on TikTok or whatever, so they're lacking even that, thing that at least I had resource to when I was a kid. And so I think, like, I remember, the other day we had to get our deck replaced, our front deck replaced at our house, and the guys who came to do it, it was a father and a son. The son was maybe like in his early 20s or something. And I was like, oh, damn, like this is the first time I've had to have some work done at my house in the last 10 years that I had somebody show up who was less than like 40 years old, if not older, because it just seems strange, right? You just don't see a lot of young guys who are doing stuff like that, who are capable of it. And I think when I hear something like that, Elliot Rodgers, Screed that you read, but a lot of these guys, the Columbine kids included, is I see a bunch of young dudes who have no idea how to behave as an adult man in the society, and they get to this point where that period of that point in their life is fast approaching, where they are going to have to go out and be a man now, and they have no idea what that looks like. And the whole idea of it is like it's just completely daunting. It's completely overwhelming, and they're just like, I'm not doing that. And I'm not going to go out and prove myself a failure to everybody that knows me, all the people that always look down on me or whatever. I'm not going to go confirm all of that by going out and being a failure in my life. And, I think like, I feel like that's a big part of it is people like our teenagers are not growing up and like learning how to be adults. My wife and I were talking about this the other day, like how, we kind of, during COVID, got in the habit a lot of times we started using some of those grocery delivery services. And we were like, damn, this is actually like really convenient. So like we do it quite a bit now. But, we were talking about it. We were like, when we have kids, like we're going to have to actually go do this because we need to bring them along. And they'll hate it because the kids hate doing stuff like that. But they need to go and be like, oh, this is how you go to the store. This is how you interact with people. All of these adult things, they need to watch and learn and figure out how to model themselves, in order to function in society when they get older. And I feel like there's a huge deficit of that. And again, even the portion of it that used to be taken up by media, even that's vacated anymore. for the most part.
Well, they have a word for it now, adulting, right? You've heard that expression. It's like, well, when I'm actually doing stuff that's adult-like, and now I'm adulting, and that's another interesting thing. I think Jordan Peterson asked, or somebody asked me at some point, what's the problem? What's causing a lot of these problems in America? And I said something along the lines, well, one of the problems is that there's not enough problems. And again, this sounds like well, there's a bunch of people that have all kinds of problems, right? I mean, you get illnesses, you got money problems, so there's problems in the world. But to your point, look, it's really easy, to call or to press a button on the phone and get Amazon to show up. It's really easy to find a dopamine hit from looking at TikTok or Instagram. It's really easy to get a dopamine hit from getting some likes from some friends on your phone. And you used to have to earn those dopamine hits a little bit more. You had to go outside, you had to do something, you had to make something, you had to build something, you had to do something. And now it's just kind of free dopamine out there. And then what happens is you fast forward from age 10 to 20, and all you've done is gotten fast, quick dopamine hits from your phone instead of getting a dopamine hit from changing your oil and getting a dopamine hit from building a shed outside and getting a dopamine hit from playing a cool song on your guitar and getting a dopamine hit from going up and talking to a girl for the first time. Like all these things that you would get dopamine from, all of a sudden you're just getting it from your phone and you've acquired no skills. You can't talk to anybody. Because let's face it, when you're a 10, 11, 12-year-old kid, boy, going and talking to a girl is like a big deal, and you're going to get that dopamine hit. You're going to feel good about it. Hey, man, if you can just turn to your phone and get a dopamine hit and basically see girls, as much girls as you want to see, and see girls in a way that you can fantasize about, but you can get it right from your phone, all of a sudden you've lost the ability to communicate with people. You don't know how to change your oil. You don't know how to build anything. You don't know how to take care of yourself. You don't know how to take care of anybody else. And yeah, you look up when you're 20 years old and you're in a bad situation.
And no idea how to do anything that takes more than one step to accomplish, right?
Yeah.
Where you actually have to encounter resistance and just understand that it just takes work now, and you have to kind of go zero. You can blame that on the person themselves if they want, but like if that's how you've been raised since you were 8 years old.
And I think maybe we're over-indexing on this a little bit. At least in my mind, because I'm still going back to this fact that you brought up of 1955, 340 beds, inpatient beds, down to 17 inpatient beds. If you take that, and I recognize that you said, well, it's not homeless people that are running around shooting people up. Yeah, I get it's not homeless people, but the homeless people are a symptom of that problem, right?
Yeah,
so you have this many homeless people. Well, you've got also then a kid that is depressed, is angry. He's got issues, and he's not getting the help that he needs.
That supermarket shooter in Buffalo, he was telling people, I'm going to go kill a bunch of people. So they grabbed him, they put him in a hospital. They held him for 48 hours, let him go, zero follow-up. And it's like, what we used to do in a situation like that, and I understand all of the potential issues with something like this, but I don't know if I really can see another solution that doesn't require decades of social reform and cultural change that, is if you're a young dude and you say in front of a bunch of people, I'm going to go shoot up my school or anything like that, you get arrested immediately and put away in a mental place where you can be looked after. I'm not talking about jail, but a mental care facility. And you get out when we feel like it's safe to let you out, and no sooner. And that's gonna mean that like some dude who's just being an edgelord, and like talking shit, try to get a rise out of people or whatever, is gonna get put away. And maybe he was just joking or whatever. That dude, is going to, I think that'll come out over time, and it will suck that happens to him, but everybody else is going to be like, did you hear what happened to Johnny? He was talking that shit about wanting to shoot up the school. He was just joking. They put him away. That maybe the social norms would kind of change where,
well, you start to get that societal pressure on people to go, oh, yeah, you can't act like that, bro. You can't do that. We're not doing that. And here's the thing. This is what this fact, you hear about mental health. And you often hear, it is going back to the homeless thing. Well, what the hell can you do about it? What could you possibly do about it? It's like, oh, we used to do something about it. We used to have 347 inpatient beds. How many outpatient beds did they have at that? Or how many outpatient doctors that were ready to do help someone? So there's something that we need to go back to the fact that we used to take people that were having mental health issues and we would take them and put them somewhere where they could get them some help, where they wouldn't hurt themselves and where they wouldn't hurt anybody else. And this is something that we used to do 95% more than we do it now. I mean, can you imagine there's 100,000 beds, 340 beds for 100,000 people? There's 3 million people in San Diego? Right? That's a lot. That's taking 1,000 people. That's opening up 1,000 beds. If you took 1,000 people and put them in mental health care in San Diego, California, you would have all kinds of improvements around here. You'd have all kinds of improvement, and you'd help those people get their lives back together, get them the psychiatric help that they need, get the medication that they need or the counseling that they need, put them in an environment where they can actually do something productive. And we've lost our way on that.
Yeah, and people will say, they'll point back to the old days and say, that there were these high-profile disasters where people were not being taken care of or were being abused. They'll point and just say, look, a lot of these people were not being helped by these places. It was just a place to keep them, and that's true.
Do better.
But that's the thing.
Do better.
We're talking about a period of time where, we didn't really know what PTSD was. You come back from combat and you're completely screwed up from everything you've experienced, and they're just like, oh, he's shell-shocked or something. So, I mean, this was a different era where we've got 50 years more of psychological research and clinical data to draw on. Not to mention the fact that a lot of stuff the abuse in those places, there was a lot of workplace stuff that was super unsafe. It was only 100 years ago we had child labor. So a lot has changed since the 1950s that I think, of course it would have to be highly regulated. We have to make sure there are a lot of checks and balances to make sure we're doing it right. But I mean, if somebody's got any kind of a solution, an immediate solution that's actually going to have an effect on these things that again doesn't require a total cultural revolution or some mass religious awakening or whatever, I am very open to hearing it. But I keep coming back to the fact that and I saw somebody else who put it this way, I can't remember who it was, but just that there are somewhere between 10 and 20 times as many people walking around today who would not have been allowed to 50 or 60 years ago. And to take those people, put them on the streets or put them back in their households, where their mental issues were manifesting in the first place, and then exposing them to all the cultural changes, the breakdown of community, the social isolation, all of that, you're just... It's like when you get to the pharmaceutical drugs, right? All the pharmaceutical trials, and you have to be very careful with how you talk about them because they're famously litigious over this stuff. But, there's black box warning on all SSRI antidepressants. A black box warning means an advisory that there are not just adverse effects, medication effects, which are side effects, but that there's serious risk of injury or death. And that specifically, it says anxiety, agitation, panic attacks, insomnia, irritability, hostility, aggressiveness, both of those which have very specific meanings that are intent, that you are experiencing violent impulses toward other people. Impulsivity, akathisia, which is you can't sit still, hypomania, which is mania but not quite as bad, have been reported in adult and pediatric patients being treated with antidepressants for major depressive disorder as well as for indications both psychiatric and non-psychiatric. Now that has to be on there because there have been just not only a lot of studies, there have been a lot of studies that have shown increases in suicidal ideation, increases in aggressive impulses, but actual things that have happened. When you go down the list of the people who have committed these kinds of killings, and other things too, like that woman several years ago who, she drowned her 5 kids in the bathtub. She was on I won't say the name of the drug, but she was on one of these things. Now people will look at that and say, well, yeah, the people who are going to go shoot up a school are people who probably have some problems, and so they're more likely to be on this stuff. And that's true. But then the thing that I always come back to is, the fact that this stuff doesn't tend to happen in the poor inner cities where they have gang violence, all that kind of stuff. Obviously, there's plenty of gun violence. So it's not like as if they're just these peaceful communities where there's no type of violence, but they're also communities where, you have poor families who maybe don't have health insurance that pays for the boys' Prozac or whatever, and the middle class kid in the suburbs, they have access to that stuff. And you look at all of the studies, and they all come out, and it's like you said, 99.9%, totally fine. But we just started giving it to tens of millions of people in no time at all,
Yeah, and you replace the opportunity to get somewhere where you can't hurt anybody else and you can't hurt yourself, and you replace that with just go on this drug, which, by the way, has these heinous side effects. I mean, irritability, hostility, aggressiveness, impulsivity. That's what we're going to give someone that's already having a hard time. So that becomes like a move. And of course, when the way these pharmaceutical companies work, in many cases, they're salesmen.
Yeah, people in other countries think we are completely insane for letting pharmaceutical companies advertise to people on television. It's illegal in most countries, and they think we are completely crazy. The idea that you just walk into a doctor's office and say, hey, I saw a commercial, I have this, especially for something like antidepressants, where, look, man, life is hard a lot of times, especially we have a society that's very competitive. You really got to look after yourself. There's not a big social safety net in a lot of ways. People are just the way our culture is. We tend to be pretty isolated from, our families, or at least large extended family networks. People don't know their neighbors. You take all of that. Financial pressures, we've had several financial collapses basically in the last few decades. All of these different pressures that are out there, that life is just going to suck sometimes. It's going to really suck for periods of time. And you can see a commercial that's going to tell you, with the authority of a doctor, a doctor's authority when you see that stuff, that, hey, do you ever feel bad about anything? Do you ever just kind of feel down or not have enough energy? Oh, okay. Well, you have a illness, and here's this. People in other countries think we're crazy for allowing that, and I agree with them.
Yeah, well, that's actually only one flank that people are getting hit on, because the actual doctors themselves are getting, they're getting office visits and office calls and dinner and, here's a nice little gift from this and a gift from that, and let me tell you how we can help you. And so the doctors are getting that way too. So then it's like a double whammy. You come into my office and you say, hey, I'd like to try this drug. And I go, oh, that's great. It's going to be perfect for you.
Yeah.
And so you're getting hit from two directions. And listen, there is, look, I work with some massive medical companies, some massive pharmaceutical companies, and there is an absolute reason, and there's some huge benefits to that, where you have people that are in, let's say, working for a pharmaceutical company or working for a medical device company, and they know the capabilities of those drugs or those medical devices better than a doctor's going to, because that's what they do for a living. And so they're able to go in and educate a doctor and really give that doctor the ability to use the right medicine or use the right device. And it is absolutely saves lives all the time. That being said, that 0.01% or 0.01% of the time where someone goes, yeah, this should work for you.
Especially when you think about these mental health psychotropic drugs, SSRIs or ADHD meds or anything like that. It's not as if, they do a brain scan and draw a little fluid from your brain to get the exact levels, and they're like, okay, you need exactly this dose of exactly this drug. That is not how it works at all. As anybody who's gotten a prescription for these things knows. You go in there and they're like, you're not feeling so good, you have low energy, you're not really motivated. All right, well, try this one. And in 3 or 4 weeks, come on back in. We'll see how you're doing. If we need to adjust the dosage, we will. Maybe we'll put you on a different one. It is trial and error.
Yeah.
And
you get this think they call it affirmation treatment, psychological affirmation. So when you come in and you tell me, hey, I feel this way, I kind of affirm, yes, that's how you feel, and I support it. We get that across the board on everything now. Right. Where instead of me going, when you come to me and say, I'm pissed at whatever, I don't say, hey, dude, that's you. That's your problem. When you say, I don't like my school, I go, yeah, well, maybe it's because you act like an asshole. Quit acting like an asshole and you'll like your school more. Or you say, hey, Jessica broke up with me. And I say, yeah, that's because she broke up with you because you're freaking failing out of your classes. She probably looks at you and think, where are you going to be in 10 years? Why don't you start getting your act together? Square your shit away. That's not what's happening. No one's getting told. They're getting, when you come to me and say, Jessica broke up with me, I say, oh no, Jessica sucks. Jessica is mean. Instead of me saying, bro, you didn't work hard enough to get Jessica. Yeah. You didn't make the football team. You need to lift more. That's where we don't have that. We don't have enough of that.
Yeah, and it comes back to what you were talking about earlier, how a lot of our kids' social interaction has been moved online, which is just a totally different environment. For one thing, well, that accountability that you're talking about right there, that your in-person interactions are just going to have, because you're going to see immediate responses from a group of people that you can't really escape. These are the people who were at your school when you're in 7th grade or whatever in 1980. Right? Whereas now you can just ignore all of those people. You have online communities that you go to. You can be a total psycho on one of these things, get yourself banned from one, start a new account and go on there, or go find another one or whatever. And so anything that, even if you can't find anybody around you who would affirm all of it, you can just ignore those people and go find it somewhere else online. You can get anything affirmed online.
One thing that I've been thinking a lot about lately, and I've actually been talking a lot about it, talking about it from on the podcast. I've been talking about it on my online training as well. And it's so horrifying. It's horrifying. And that is the malleability of the human mind. And we all think that this human mind, the strong will, free will, we're all out there. And if when someone messes with you, you mess with them back. And someone tells you something, you tell them to shut up. And that's kind of how we feel. We kind of feel, I think human beings generally, we feel like we have our own agency in what's going on. It's kind of our front running operating system is that, hey, I'm an individual. I'm an individual human being. I have agency. I'm going to kind of do what I want. We all kind of have that front-running operating system. But man, the one layer below that front-running operating system is this completely malleable thing that you keep that surface operating system running. You're thinking that you're doing your own thing, and you are just getting manipulated and played, and it happens en masse. There's no better example really than the Nazis, than the Nazi Party in Germany. Go watch Triumph of the Will and see hundreds of thousands of people that are just on board. They're just on board with what's going on. That happens. Your podcast with talking about Jim Jones.
Yeah, cults are a perfect example.
Cults are a perfect example of how people, you read it, you hear it, and the weird thing is, it's a weird phenomenon that your front-running sort of operating system, thinking that you have agency, thinking that you're making choices, thinking that you're moving in this direction because you want to and because it's the best thing for you, and you kind of see it. People have that going on. At the same time, they have no idea that they're falling right into a trap. They're being a sheep, following everything else that's happening.
Yeah, like the internet environment makes it so that everybody can just kind of go join a cult without the stigma of you're in a cult. I even think about I go on my Twitter feed and I'll tweet something, could be anything. And every once in a while I'll get someone who will tell me I'm full of shit, but 99.9, because these are my followers. These are the people that notice my tweets, the ones who might like it, that Twitter's algorithms push it to. And so 99% of what I get back is all affirming. And you can just kind of head off in any direction. One of the ways that I put it in that Jim Jones series was, if you have somebody who is delusional, let's say, which he was, early in the 50s, he was having delusions that he was getting messages from space aliens that were telling him a nuclear war was happening and all that. You start to have something like that happening, in like most people's lives. You go tell somebody about it, they're going to go, okay, great.
And if it was 1955, they could take you to somewhere and put you into a place where you get some help.
Right. And
but now you tweet that out, and what happens?
I'll get 100 new followers in the next 2 hours of people who all think that, I finally figured it out. And, but that's the thing, right? What happens when you take somebody who starts to spiral in a given direction and put them in an environment where all anybody tells them is, what, aliens? Totally. What should we do about it? And, I think, we see what happens, and I worry. I mean, I know this is maybe a little bit trite to say these days, but, like the psychological mechanism of schizophrenia, leaving aside like the neurological and like genetic aspects of it, but the way like schizophrenia often seems to develop, and that's a broad category, mental illness, obviously, but is that somebody gets, withdrawn and separated from those feedback loops that they get from other people. And once that happens, you can kind of just go off in any direction. I mean, you get people, who, the mind can do anything. Go read one of Oliver Sacks's books. He's a neurologist who wrote, he got famous for writing that book Awakenings that became a movie back in the day. And then he wrote a bunch of other books where he talks about people who like have like damage in a certain part of their brain. One of his books is called The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat, because something happened in his brain and he just became convinced that his wife was a hat. And, the brain can go just any direction and it can go way off over a cliff in any direction if you don't have those social feedback loops to kind of keep everybody on the same page. Now, sometimes, you look at like the Aztecs or something. I'm probably going to get in trouble for that one. Let's say the Nazis, to keep it safe. That sometimes you can get a whole society that can start giving each other that reinforcement, and the whole big group of them can just go fly off a cliff together. That can happen too. You see it in smaller like doses with cults, obviously.
The interesting thing about the social feedback on social media is I don't have to live with you.
Yeah.
So you're not, you're going to put something out. I don't have to deal with you. We don't have to work together. We don't even have to interact. I'm never going to see you in my life. So I can do it. Just have a good time, just egging you on.
Yeah.
And we can join forces. Where for me, I'm just joining forces because I'm having fun. I'm a bot, or I'm a shit poster? Mm-hmm. I'm a shit poster. So I'm just, you tell them, Darryl, you tell them what's up. And you're, oh, yeah. And you start going, oh, yeah, and you should check this guy out, Darryl. And you check some other guy. And this guy encourages you, too. And you get these echo chambers, overused word, but you get these social feedback where it's not somebody that I have to deal with. Because if I work with you and you come into work with me and you're talking some crazy shit, I'm like, hey, bro, what are you talking about? That's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. Stop. Yeah. And you go, ooh. I can put you in check in real life. Whereas in the social media world, you're not getting put in check by anybody. Sure, there might be someone else.
You block them.
And you block them, or there's 58 other people that jump on board and smash that person for, pointing something out. And so you end up in these situations where you're just getting worse and worse. You're going further down that rabbit hole, and it's just not freaking healthy. Yeah. It's horrible. But in real life, where I have to deal with you, I go, hey man, you can't wear that in here. You can't wear that kind of clothes in here. What's wrong with you?
Yeah.
Or hey, you can't act that way. Hey, you can't treat somebody like that. It doesn't happen in the virtual world, and that's a problem. And by the time someone looks up, by the time a 16, 17, 18-year-old kid looks up, he's already freaking got two semi-automatic rifles and a bunch of guns and a bunch of ammunition, and he thinks, oh, okay, cool. No one's put him in check. No one put him in check, and was almost like, hey, man, what are you doing talking that kind of shit?
Yeah.
Can't talk like that.
Yeah, like you remember we were talking about like the journals, or just crazy shit, like when you're in middle school and high school and your death metal phase or whatever, and you're bored in class, like drawing scenes of just destruction and war and whatever, writing about death, etc. Now all that stuff goes online. You're not just writing it in your little notebook. You're writing it online. And there are a bunch of other people who are giving you that social feedback and social affirmation for it. And so now, instead of just being this little sort of thing, you're blowing off some steam or exploring some ideas that are just starting to come into your head, you're actually going and joining a little quote-unquote like community that's based around that kind of talk and that sort of aesthetic and feeling, which is a very different thing. And it's very dangerous.
Yeah.
I want to talk a little bit more before we wrap up. I think we should talk a little more about the media, because it's a huge part of this, and not just the internet and social media, because this all started before any of that was really, I think it's an accelerant for sure, but this stuff did start to change. You talked about Columbine. Columbine was a turning point in so many ways. And one of the big ways, I think, is that Columbine was the moment, maybe you saw a little bit of this with the OJ trial, actually. But where the 24/7 sort of disaster coverage of something like that, with all the shock and horror and fear and all of outrage and everything, became merged with the political dialogue about that topic. And those two things kind of got put together, so that now that's how everything is reported. From mass shootings to Hurricane Katrina. Something horrible happens, and you have all of the sort of shock, horror, and outrage of the 24/7 media cycle focus on this stuff and the sensationalism or whatever, coupled with and the political enemies that you already had, the people you already hated, they're to blame for this. And it's put together in a very, very toxic mix. And, I rewatched the other day in prep for this episode, Natural Born Killers. I don't know how long it's been since you've seen that, but
been a while. Yeah.
It's a much uglier movie than I remembered it when I was when I was younger and I saw it. And maybe that's just because I used to like horror movies, and now I watch it, I'm just like, ugh, I can't handle this stuff anymore. So I'm probably getting soft in my old age, and that's probably part of it. It's a very ugly movie, like it doesn't hold back or like. But there's this one scene toward the end where Woody Harrelson, the character, is being interviewed by Robert Downey Jr. This is after they've committed all their murders and everything. They're in prison, and he's interviewing them. Or maybe it's after they escape with him. And he says the media is like the weather, except it's man-made weather. And I was like, it's a very interesting way to put it. It's this like idea where, the media can like turn the dial up a few degrees, or they can turn it down a few degrees. And I'm not implying there's some CEO up there who's doing that. I think, but it is, the media can turn it up a few degrees. And if you think about like an analogy with how like rising global temperatures happen, you turn the temperature up a degree or two, and it's not as if like the entire globe goes up a degree or two. It's that over here it stays the same, and over there's like more hurricanes, and over there's wildfires and a drought, and then over there it's fine. And so you turn the media turns that dial up a little bit, and over here it's fine. Jocko and I, we watch it and we're like, okay, or you inject the the violence in video games, just all of the different cultural things we're talking about, and we see it and we're fine. But then over here, there's like, it's going to manifest in this really monstrous way. And I think that the media has, I will say, most people aren't really aware of this. This was something that I read in Sue Klebold's book, though, that the media, there have been a lot of changes in the way that they cover these things. At least the mass media, the large corporate mass media, where you'll notice that like very often they won't show pictures of the person. Mm-hmm. There was a lot of outrage, including from a lot of people in the media industry back when the Boston Marathon bombing happened, and Rolling Stone put that kid's picture on the cover, and he looks like a rock star, basically. And there were a lot of, because it broke rules when they did that. Like there are like these sort of like style guides, basically, of like how do you handle something like this. Now, of course, the problem with that is, all right, so CNN and Fox News and the big newspapers are going to follow those rules, but most people are getting all this stuff from the internet these days. And I think, like watching Natural Born Killers, actually, one of the things that made me really uncomfortable about it is a critique of like media sensationalizing of all of these type of events and how it creates this feedback loop that causes these type of things, but that the movie itself like kind of does that. And I get that that's part of the way they accomplish what they're trying to do with the movie, but the Columbine kids, they loved that movie, and they actually referred to the day that they were going to go kill everybody at school as NBK, after Natural Born Killers. And so, it's a tough thing, because we don't, this is not some totalitarian, like centrally planned, like society where you can control all the way the media handles these things. If the media wants to, if Rolling Stone wants to put that kid on the cover, they can put that kid on the cover. And it seems like if somebody can do it, then somebody's going to do it. Maybe not everybody, but
yeah. So where does that leave us? Well, you actually, believe it or not, do have some control over this. You have control over what stories you click on. You have control over what media outlets you follow. You have control over who you interact with and how much oxygen you give them. You have the ability to allow media to dehumanize people, human beings. You have the ability to say no to that. You have the ability not to watch certain movies. You have the ability not to, get your kids certain video games. You have the ability to talk to them through what these things really are. We do have those abilities to do those kind of things. We have the ability to, with the malleability of the human mind and how open to influence people are. Well, you, no matter who you are, have the ability to influence people to move in a better direction, to look at things in a better way, to form connections with people, to reach out, to communicate to people in a positive way, to not get hyper emotional over things. This is stuff that we can all do. Stuff we can all do. To turn off the Twitter feed, to unfollow idiots, to not watch a news broadcast that's hyping up some horrible situation. This is stuff that we all have control. We can control a lot of what comes in. You can control a lot of what comes into your world. You can control a lot of what you decide to consume. And I think barring, like you said, some kind of a mass control over the media and laws against this and laws against that, what we can do is kind of vote with our eyes, vote with our clicks, and try and influence the people around you to do the same thing. And that seems like a small thing, but the reality is you have a huge amount of influence over the people you associate with. People are malleable. You're malleable. So you're malleable. So you need to watch what you're partaking in. You need to watch what you're looking at. You need to watch what you're consuming. And other people around you, they're malleable. And you can either press them to go watch some stupid, hysterical, crazy thing on social media, or you can talk to them as a human being. You can form relationships with other people. You can help out a kid that seems like maybe he's a little distraught about something. Maybe you help that kid, get that kid a pull-up bar. Get that kid into a jiu-jitsu class. Get that kid a guitar. Talk to them about where they can be in 3 years. Talk to them about the fact that when you were 14 years old or 15 years old, life was hard for you too. Talk to them about that so they understand, man, it's okay. It's okay. Yeah. It's hard to be 14. It's hard to be 16 years old. It's hard to get rejected. It's hard to not fit in. You will. You will. You'll be all right. Look at this book. Read this. Watch this. Don't watch that. That's what we can do. And that's what it's going to take. What can you do to help the people in your world, in your span of influence? And you do have influence. That's where I'm at.
Yeah, and the only thing I would add to it is if, you're in one of those situations where you don't want to stigmatize everybody that's like this, because it's still such a incredibly rare occurrence that one of these things happens, even as common as they are now. But you know what? If you're in high school, if you're in college, and there's, the kid there that nobody likes, the kid that nobody wants to sit with at lunch, the kid who people like to talk shit to or whatever, just be the one who like goes and says, "Hey man, how's it going?" I'm not saying you have to be his best friend. Just say what's going on, because to somebody who's in that situation, having somebody who is, not an outcast like them, just come up and acknowledge them and say hello is often a huge deal. And very often, you'd be surprised how often it can mean the difference between them hurting themselves or not that day. I mean, sometimes people are teetering on the edge, and if you see, if other people are picking on the kid, be the one who just steps up and says, "Hey man, back off, chill out." I mean, because nobody, look, when I was a kid, sometimes I would do that. I'd be the one to step up and be like, leave that kid alone. Sometimes I wouldn't. Sometimes, probably a few times, I would join in because, you don't want to become the target, or you want to be cool or whatever. Everybody's trying to be accepted when you're finding out who you are at that age. But I'll tell you that every time that I didn't step in and I didn't say anything and I was too scared or too cowardly or whatever, there are incidents in 3rd, 4th, 5th grade that I remember to this day and I regret. And there's no way you're going to regret being the one who steps up and stands up for somebody like that. And it can make a huge difference in people's lives. Just having one person do that, it can make a huge difference.
Yeah, every single one of us can do that, can reach out, can step up, can have so much influence. It's one of those leadership lessons that I learned is that, when you're in a leadership position, you have so much influence. And when you say something positive to someone, it really hits them. And when you say something negative to someone, it really hits them. Well, that's not just from a leadership position, especially for someone that's isolated, for someone that's disconnected, for someone that's an outcast, for someone that doesn't communicate properly with other people or has a hard time doing it. And what are they going through in their life? And what kind of abuse are they suffering? And you as a person have such an opportunity and have such a huge amount of influence over other people. And like Darryl just said, don't be shy about doing that. Don't be shy about trying to communicate with other people, because an isolated human being in this day and age, with all the horrible influences that are out there, well, you can actually be a positive influence. So let's go do it. With that, thanks for tuning in, everybody. Subscribe if you haven't yet. Check out our other podcasts. I've got Jocko Podcast, Warrior Kid Podcast, Jocko Underground. Darryl's got another podcast. We mentioned it a couple times today. He's working on a new series right now. I just heard the opening of the new series.
You contributed to that opening, actually. About
the labor movement. Yeah. You reread one of things that I've read in the past. Thud, right? I'm already so excited that you're covering that topic. It's about the labor movement. You can support Darryl by going to martyrmade.substack.com, and you can also just listen to his podcast, Martyr Made. You can support all these podcasts by getting some gear from jockostore.com or jockofuel.com or originusa.com, or you can subscribe to my what is it? I guess I have like a little alternate podcast platform, jockounderground.com, and I have a leadership consulting company called Echelon Front at echelonfront.com.
One thing I want to mention to everybody today is a friend of mine, somebody I've talked to you about before. Him and another veteran friend are currently doing an 800-mile kayak trip down the Atlantic coast to raise money for veterans. They're through the Gary Sinise Foundation. So if anybody is interested in following what they're doing or maybe making a small donation, if you can swing it, I'll put the link in the show notes.
Right on, man. That's the first I'm hearing about that.
I sent you a link. Check your text.
Okay, I'll check my text. When did you send it?
I think yesterday.
Okay. Well, I'll have to go check my texts. That sounds awesome. It's very squared away. So, yeah, check that out as well. Do you have the link on? You can say it right now.
Well, no. I'll put it. I'll put it in the show notes. It's kind of long, so.
One of those long links. Yeah. They didn't just get jocko.com.
Yeah.
So there you go. Another way to support some people out there that need some help right now. And with that, thanks for listening as things unravel, and thanks for trying to prevent things from unraveling more. It's the best we can do right now. And until next time, this is Darryl and Jocko.